MGTV, η ομογένεια κοντά σας.
My name is Paul Pavlakos. I'm the Supreme Secretary for the Sons of PERICLES. Good afternoon. Today we're giving a presentation on the Hellenic genocide of the 20th century. The goal of the presentation is to educate our young audience today for the first time on a very important and traumatic atrocity in history, and not to talk about it as a single moment in history, but to understand the current impact and how it impacts us today as a community. Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. I'd like first, before I start, to introduce Brother Luke Gatsosap, the Lieutenant Governor of District 6, and to speak a little bit about the Seraphim Canudis lecture series as a whole.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here today, and for us it's a real fantastic privilege actually to be here, in particular since I got the notice actually from Paul that you wanted to speak about this particular topic, which is an extremely important topic. We started the Canudis series about a year ago. It's a fantastic series. Canudis was a very famous Hellenic American diplomat, historian. As a matter of fact, on the history side, he's considered the first historian of the Hellenes in the Western Hemisphere. Every book that you read on Hellenic American history will always have in its bibliography the works of Canudis, because during the latter 19th century, the early 20th century, he actually literally went through every community in the United States and in Canada, every Hellenic community, and he basically wrote about those communities in situ at those particular times. He had photos, and he also had a very famous series called the Hellenic American Business Guide. And in the Hellenic American Business Guide, he actually listed every business in the United States and Canada that was Hellenic owned, city by city, state by state. And again, that's also a very important work in Hellenic American history. The first Canudis lecture that we did, and the reason why we called it the Canudis lecture series, is because he was also a former president of Delphi 25. He was very famous in Ahepa because he also spoke at the conventions. In particular, he was also an attorney, both Hellenic trained and American trained. And during that time, when it came for the period of Americanization, to become Americans, people were trying to figure out the discipline and the appropriate process to make everyone American citizens. And he actually wrote various articles, in particular with the Ethnikoi Kirika, and discussing issues of immigration, how to become a citizen, how do you do business in the United States, and all the things that, quite frankly, were very important, not only to Hellenic Americans, but also Ahepa itself. The first one that we did, lecture about a year ago, had to do with the Hellenic Revolution. And we took a different tact on the revolution. We didn't just speak about what happened in Greece, but we actually spoke about the Phil-Hellenes and the philosophical underpinnings of the revolution. It was very well received. The second one that we did relates a little bit to this topic. It had to do with the Istanbul Program, which took place in Constantinople in September 6th and 7th of 1955, and again we had various professors speaking during that session, and again extremely well received. The third one that we did had to do with World War II. It had to do with the merchant marines, and it had to do with the loss of Hellenic lives on the open seas and the sacrifices of the Hellenic shipping companies and the merchant marines in terms of the war effort and what they did, in fact, to help save Europe. This one here is the fourth in the series, and a very important one. It's a topic that's not usually discussed by many people. It's a topic that's complicated, and I'm sure it'll come up in both the presentation and the questions and answers. And it's a topic that Hellenic people don't also know very well. Forget about other people, but Hellenic people don't know very well. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I thank both the sons and the daughters for putting this together. As I was speaking earlier to Paul and the Governor Debbie, this should be taken nationally. What's taking place today is a very important topic and a very important theme that the sons and the daughters should make their theme on a national level. Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon. What a pleasure to be here today. And we have the entire Ahepa family here. We have the sons of Pericles, we have the Maids, Ahepa brothers, and the daughters. I welcome all of you. And let me also congratulate our Lieutenant Governor, Lukatzos, and also the Director of Hellenism, Billy Chrysokos, who's going to lecture today. It was amazing that we were able to start the Sarafim Canudis lecture series. And for those of you that are here, you know that last year we were recognized as the so-called best district in the entire Ahepa domain. Best district was not just based on numbers. The numbers are nice. We were way up there, number one. But let's talk about the reality. The reality is that this district has emphasized the core values of what Ahepa stands for. Brothers Lukatzos and the Director of Hellenism have put Hellenism way up there, way up there. These lectures have taught many of us about what happened in our history. And yes, the lectures on Orchid Day that we had on Ellis Island, the lectures at the 3 West Club with the 1955 pogrom, Istanbul pogrom, the lectures that you're going to hear about the Greek Revolution, all of these things are very, very important. And of course, we have the Greek parade coming up on April 14th, which will reinforce all of these important things about Hellenism. We're learning about these things, a refresher course for many of us. We have an obligation to pass this along to our children and friends, so this history is never forgotten. Brother Lou is an ambassador. He did the lecture on the Hellenic Merchant Marines just recently. From that lecture, he was able to go to Greece, and they had the 10th year anniversary of the Victory ships. The one ship that's left, 10-year anniversary in Piraeus, Greece. I recognize you, and congratulations, Brother Lou. I know that it was an amazing lecture and speech, and you put us on the map once again. For those of you that have forgotten your history, 2,000 Hellenic merchant marines perished during World War II. That's the blood, sweat, and tears of our brothers, and it should never, ever be forgotten. Zito Elada, congratulations to all of you, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Thank you again for everyone coming out. I think the goal for me of this presentation is to educate particularly the young demographic, the sons and the maids, on a very important and terrible event in our history. We talked a lot this morning about community and cooperation, and I think understanding our history, where we come from, is an important part of building our community. Understanding what ties us together, what events that our shared ancestors had to go through, is an important part of coming together now. And with that being said, I hope that we can spark a discussion or a conversation about the shared history of our ancestors in our current community, and not only talk about it as if it's a single moment in history 100 years ago, but actually tie it back to how it affects us in current day and how it affects our youth communities right now. Overview and big picture. So the 20th century Hellenic genocide occurred from 1914 to 1923 officially. I think 3 common themes that I want us to keep in mind is that this genocide was not spontaneous, but it was systematic. It did not affect just one region, but an entire area. And it's not a static moment in history, but it rather had a ripple effect that affects us now in current day. So on the note of systematic that affect multiple regions, it's important to understand that even though this presentation is about particularly the Hellenic genocide, it regarded the entire Christian population in Turkey at the time. So we have, a quote by one of the pastors saying that this was a persecution aimed at the elimination of the Christian element in Turkey. Even though we're talking about ethnic Greeks, this affected all Christians, mainly Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians, and this ties us together as a common atrocity we had to endure. As far as where this occurred, modern-day Turkey, so regionally, this occurred in Asia Minor, Pontus, and Thrace. That will be important later, that even though it occurred in 3 different regions, ethnically, they were all Greeks that were affected. Currently, there are regional recognitions in all 3 regions, Asia Minor, Pontus, and Thrace, which we'll discuss further under current impact. And during this time, in 9 years, 1.2 million ethnic Greeks were either killed or deported. That's estimates of death toll, 500,000 to 900,000, and another almost 800,000 Greeks made to leave their homes and go to another area under harsh conditions. Many didn't survive, and even those that did were forced to flee their homes. So this is a very, very terrible time in our history, and I think it's important for us to understand it. This also didn't just affect Europe. Even though it occurred in Europe, these are all articles from the New York Times, actually. So this was something that even while it was occurring was gaining awareness in the US. We have a New York Times article from 1915 stating that the Christians at the time were in great peril. By 1917, relief posters were being placed in New York asking US citizens to buy Liberty bonds to provide relief to Syrian, Assyrian, Armenian, and Greek refugees because of the events that they were going through at the time. And by 1921, another New York Times article, you have 700,000 Greeks with, at that time, 2 years still left in the genocide. By then, 700,000 Greeks were already victims of the genocide. So a brief geography again to understand the context of where and when this took place. This is a map of modern day, obviously, Greece and Turkey. And these are the 3 regions broken down. So in yellow, you'll see what is historically Thrace, specifically Eastern Thrace. In the blue is Asian Minor or Anatolia. And you'll notice that Pontus, with the red outline, even though it's sometimes referred to as a separate region, is actually within Anatolia or within Asia Minor. That will become important later on. All of these crosses are a city where a killing took place. These are all massacres of ethnic Greeks. So you'll see mostly, obviously, by the Greek-Turkish border, makes sense that would be the heavy population that was killed, but you'll see all throughout Turkey they were committing genocide against our people for a full 9 years. Timeline, again, understanding the context of when this takes place. So 1908, you have the Young Turk Revolution. At the time, Turkey was a very Muslim-oriented state. They were ruled by, they were the Ottoman Empire at the time, and they were ruled by sultans. You had the Young Turk Revolution come in, and they promoted, under the Committee of Union and Progress at the time was what the party was called, they promoted secularism and a more progressive platform. Now, the only caveat to that was part of their progressive platform was the devaluation of human life as stated by the CUP. So they valued a lot of the Eastern, particularly Japanese actually, history where it was okay for people to die for a greater cause and we should be against the Western value of human life because we're okay with sacrificing our people. That was one of the strong platforms of the CUP officers at the time. Even when they came into power, this is straight from a CUP document, that the Committee of Union and Progress made a clear decision at the time. The source of trouble in Western Anatolia would be removed. The Greeks would be cleared out by means of political and economic measures. Before anything else, it would be necessary to weaken and break the economically powerful Greeks. So this was a platform of promoting ethnically Turkish people, and anybody who was not ethnically Turkish would be either through economically, politically, or if it came down to it, eventually deportations and killings would be eliminated. Even though the formal genocide starts in 1914, the first massacre is actually all the way back in 1912, and you'll see the dots are where the massacres occurred moving forward. Evali is the name of the village. This was an area where 167 men, women, and children were killed by CUP officers. One thing I noticed when I was doing a lot of the research actually is Evali is what it's historically called. Now it's called Evalik. They've Turkicized almost the names of a lot of these villages that were traditionally ethnically Greek, and that'll become a common theme throughout the presentation. You'll see not only did they eliminate the people, they also changed the name, and there's a lot of Greek culture that was erased as a result of this. Next event was 1914, Black Easter in Eastern Thrace. So this is regarded as the start of the genocide within the Eastern Thrace region. On Easter Sunday of 1914, which was April 6th, officers came into regions of Thrace and killed 200, again, men, women, and children. The events became so bad at the time that a few days later or a few weeks later, the ecumenical patriarch actually declared that Christians were being persecuted, and they shut down all the schools and the churches, essentially declaring what would be present-day state of national emergency because of the violence that was occurring in the Eastern Thrace region. We move on to June 1914, Phocaea massacre. This was another, it was pronounced Phocaea at the time. Now it's changed, I think it's Foca, but it's spelled differently. It's more Turkified, the name of the Toyo. This was, again, Turkish soldiers coming into a village. Not only did they kill 100 people, they also looted every home that they could find. The violence was so bad that because this is a coastal region, residents of the village were actually trying to flee via the harbor, and many drowned in the chaos. They were being pushed up against the water and were drowning trying to flee these killings that were occurring. By 1915, we have obviously the outbreak of World War I in 1914. You had, because of that, Greeks were being conscripted into, they weren't allowed to be, that was another thing, when World War I occurred, the Turks would not allow ethnically Greek people in Turkey to be armed. So as a result, they still wanted them to support the Turkish war effort during World War I, and so they put them into labor battalions, which were essentially at that time concentration camps, unarmed under very harsh conditions. Many obviously died throughout those conditions, and even those that didn't were made to do hard labor in order to support the war. By 1916, you have the deportations and killings spread to the Pontos region. An example of some of the statistics that come in at that time, in one of the Pontic provinces of Amasya, at the time you had 72,375 Greeks. Out of a total of, at the time there were 136,000 Greeks in the area. 72,000 were deported. So a pretty sizable population, and of those 72,000, over 70% died due to hardship during the travels trying to be deported into the interior. By 1917, we're back over in Western Anatolia, where another 30,000 are being deported from the borders of Turkey and Greece over into the interior of Asia Minor, over closer to Syria. These are a few pictures. This one is actually from the Phocaea massacre. You can see the buildings burning. And to the right is actually a group of children that were being deported at the time. They frankly rounded them up like cattle and had them deported. Many were separated during that time. And this is a picture of some of the conditions that they lived under. As I said, I want to stress the systematic nature of these events. This was not something that was spontaneous. This was not something that was just associated with the war. This was a continuous and consistent strategy to eliminate Christians from the Turkish region. Now that can be seen by 1919. At this point, World War I is supposed to be over. The CUP officers who were responsible for the deaths of, up to that point, hundreds of thousands of Christian people were sentenced to death for their crimes. And one would think that would be the end of it, but unfortunately, Mustafa Kemal comes in with the Turkish nationalist movement, and again promises secularism, a progressive platform, but again, part of this requires Turkification. So if you are not ethnically Turkish under Mustafa Kemal's platform, you do not belong in Turkey. Under Mustafa Kemal's platform, Turkey is the superior country, Turkish is the superior ethnicity. So even though you have officers sentenced to death for crimes, those proceedings were interrupted, those officers were never killed, they ended up getting exiled instead, and the violence continued under a new regime, this time under Ataturk, and under this strategy of Turkification. 1921, you have more deportations and killings in Samsun. By 1922, this is probably one of the most well-known events, the burning of Smyrna in September of 1922. Even before the fire itself broke out, Turkish officers were invading Smyrna, which is now called Izmir. It was predominantly ethnically Greek and Armenian at the time. That is no longer the case. And even before the fires broke out on September 13th, there was violence, there was looting, there was raping, there were terrible atrocities being committed. And once the fires broke out on September 13th, they lasted for 9 days. During those 9 days, while the village was burning, they weren't extinguished for 9 days. So you had the residents, again, because this is a coastal region, trying to flee and getting packed up against the water, trying to escape the fire. For 2 weeks, they were forced to remain in a coastal area, displaced from their homes, until the fires could be extinguished. These are, again, this is photographs from Smyrna itself. To the right is victims of the Smyrna fire, and to the left is actually a faraway view of the city burning. After Smyrna, you then have 1923, finally the Treaty of Lausanne is signed, and this marks the official end to the violence. This was supposed to be a truce between Greece and Turkey. We'll discuss what that meant for us currently. But after, well, here's a few pictures first again. In the top left, these are refugees sheltered in Syrian caves. So a lot of the refugees, once they were deported into the interior of Asia Minor, they would end up hiding in caves or hiding elsewhere to escape further violence from their people. Top right, you have, again, children being displaced. These were also in Syria circa 1915, children being displaced from their home. The bottom left, actually this was a church altar, and they burned down the churches, so this is what's left of it. You can almost see the foundation of where the altar was before it was burned, and now that the church has been burnt to the ground, this is all that's left. To the bottom right, for me, was probably the most impactful picture. So this is one picture of thousands of children that were found. They were found in cellars, in cages, and they were often given drugs because that would stop them from crying, and that was the only way to get them to be quiet, essentially. And this is how a lot of them were found if and when they did get rescued. So again, as I mentioned, this is a 9-year period, but it had a much longer effect on afterwards and also up to current day. So the aftermath, the genocide is over, but as part of the treaty, there was the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. So Greece would send part of its Muslims to Turkey, and Turkey would send its ethnic Greeks back to Greece. For Turkey, they're quoted as having envisioned this as a way to formalize and make permanent the flight of its native Greek Orthodox peoples following their genocide. By 1924, right after the population exchange, the Christian population in Turkey was reduced from 4.4 million to 770,000. By the 1940s, this is right around the Holocaust area, this is when we finally start to have the term genocide coined. In a New York Times article in 1946, right after World War II ends, you have, quote, "Genocide is no new phenomenon, nor has it been utterly ignored in the past. The massacres of Greeks and Armenians by the Turks prompted diplomatic action without punishment." So you have an example of in the 1940s when they're coining the term genocide, even though it's in reference to the Holocaust, they're referring back to the Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian genocide for reference. 2 years later, actually, the UN would actually come out with a Convention of Human Rights and formalize the definition of genocide. And again, while the Holocaust was the main driver, you have constant reference to this Christian genocide of the 1910s and 20s. So at the time, after the population exchange, there was about 770,000 Greeks left. 220,000 of those were actually in Istanbul itself. And this to me is telling because in 1955, September, you have the Istanbul pogrom. This was one of the hubs still of ethnic Greeks, Istanbul was at the time. And you had waves of Turkish citizens and Turkish officers coming through the streets. The first wave would break into stores, the second wave would loot the stores, and the third wave would burn down the stores. And this was, frankly, an example of even 30 years later, ethnic Greeks being discriminated against and having atrocities committed against them with the goal of pushing them out of the region. So that brings us to our current impact, how it affects us today. This is a graph of the Greek Orthodox population of Istanbul, and you can see during the genocide, it went up from about 31%, it dropped all the way to 12% in 1919, 1920. So throughout the genocide, you had a complete, almost extermination of the Greek Orthodox people within the region. I thought it was interesting to contrast it with Western Thrace, which is the yellow region. Western Thrace, this was Greece and Bulgaria, so there wasn't genocide as much in those areas, whereas Eastern Thrace in the blue was where a lot of the genocide occurred. So Western Thrace, where there was nothing, you still have 44% Christian in 1914, 55% Christian in present day. Whereas in Turkey as a whole, where this occurred, all of this blue was ethnic Greeks at the time as of 1910. Now take it to present day, no Greeks whatsoever. The red is entirely Turkish. They've all but eliminated ethnic Greeks from the coastal lines, from the interiors. I believe out of the entire population of Turkey, maybe 2% is Christian is the last that I read. So these things affect us now. This is the current population of Turkey. Something that happened 100 years ago is now affecting the culture, it's affecting the population and the demographic, and we have further current impact. As I said before, the Treaty of Lausanne was meant to protect religious minorities and meant to set the borders between Greece and Turkey. Even though this was established in 1923, you still have now border disputes occurring between Greece and Turkey. So you have what is now being referred to as gray zones, implying that there are areas that are not firmly set. Now, I think this might be an interesting conversation for later, actually, but the treaty sets borders. So there's nothing in the treaty that applies to gray zones. It's relatively black and white as far as what a border is, but you still have rhetoric being used as far as there are gray zones in the Aegean, claims that the treaty must be modernized and revised, and of course there's use of rhetoric by Erdogan himself, quoting a Turkish folk song actually during the time of the genocide, that one of the verses was throwing the Greeks into the sea, and you still have now them using that, knowing full well that that's what it means, knowing full well that they're referring to a time when 1.2 million Greeks were killed or deported. They're using a phrase, if anything happens with the Greeks, I'll throw the Greeks into the sea.
Passing a law that they recognize the Hellenic genocide or the Armenian genocide or any of these genocides, Turkey will actually threaten that particular country, and they've done it. It's actually a fact, and if you check it out, you'll see that in fact, not only will they threaten, they'll have politicians, if it's the United States, they'll have actually their politicians that they give tens of millions of dollars for, by the way, to support their activities and to make sure these type of things are kept extremely quiet. You have to understand, when we're talking about the Turks and Turkey, by genocide, okay, is something that doesn't come out of their mouth. And when you say, who are they? The Turks killed the Greeks, the Armenians, the Assyrians, or what have you. When you do DNA tests of the Turks, the so-called Turks, only about 20% to 25% of the Turks, in terms of their bloodlines, are in fact Turkish. These were people that were basically assimilated, and more recently, and within the last 100 years or so, they've Turkified these people. They've made them into Turks. You can, and by the way, when I said it's a philosophy, I'm not kidding. It's a true philosophy that they had from the late 19th century, and it was basically a writer, a person, who's considered the father of Turkish nationalism. It's this fellow, and look him up when you get a chance. It's this fellow Mehmet Ziga, who's the father of Turkish nationalism, and his concepts of Turkification, to make everyone Turkish. Didn't matter whether they were Christian, Orthodox, or what have you, to make them Turkish, was the philosophy of what we talked about before, the Young Turks and the CUP that was mentioned in the initial discussion. That was a policy of the Ottomans, the late Ottomans, and certainly the original Turkish government. They literally wanted you to convert, become Turks, etc., not speak any foreign language in the street. They had laws that said you could not speak any other language except Turkish in Turkey. They had actually within their various constitutions over a period of time that prevented other people from having certain types of occupations or jobs. In other words, they made it so difficult for you that you had to become a Turk, or you had to leave, or you had to exit. So this Turkification process was, you become a Turk, we get rid of you, or we kill you. And that's what took place. And what we haven't talked about is the forced marches, where they forced people out of certain areas, and in fact, they killed them when they were basically going into into the hinterland, let's say, of Turkey. And there were people ready, thousands of people who took over their houses. In other words, they took over their houses, they took over all their lands, they took over all their wealth. So when Brother Paul here was mentioning what was taking place in the coastline of Asia Minor, outside of Smyrna, okay, which was burned in 22, years before that, they literally were going into communities and forcing them out of the communities, forced them in many cases to flee into the islands. They were taking them into the hinterland. They were taking the children, and again, Turkifying them. They would be killing people. We don't know how many people got killed, actually, because the Turks were not as good as the Germans. The Germans recorded everybody that got killed. That was a big mistake. That's why after the war they got totally screwed. But the Turks killed everybody, didn't have anything, put people in ditches. Oh, we don't know what happened. They took over your house and they say, oh, we don't know who lived here before. You may go in here and say, who lived here? Right. I remember I went to Constantinople. I went into a church that looked like it was messed up. I went over there. I looked at this place. This place looked all messed up. And I went to the people locally and I said to them, what is that? What happened over here? And they looked at me, nobody knew anything. Nobody knew anything of what was going on. So in other words, this is a policy, Turkification, and it requires study. And it's up to us, by the way, to explain to ourselves, because we haven't explained to ourselves what's going on, what's happening, and what's continuing to happen. Even though we talk about up to 1922, 1923, the reality is this happened in the 30s, it happened in the 40s, it happened in the 50s, it happened in the 60s, by the way, when the final population started to leave Constantinople. Serious problem that we have to take care of.
And the 70s, Cyprus.
And the 70s. Yes.
And Brother Lou, you just mentioned the fires of Smyrna.
Yes.
And we know that thousands of people perished during the long weekend. And my question is this: while this was happening, what was the role of the British that were there during this atrocity?
Well, there's a Greek song by Dalatas, if you remember, where he talks about Smyrna. In other words, Smyrna is burning. And a few of the words that he says in that particular song is, he says, "Και οι φίλοι τους χτυπάγανε." In other words, as people were jumping into the sea, and there were all these ships in Smyrna, outside of Smyrna, okay, they actually did not take those Armenians or Greeks or Assyrians on board at all. And as a matter of fact, they hit them, so they basically ended up getting killed. There was only one ship. This is important, by the way. There was only one ship that was there, okay, and it was a Japanese ship. It was a Japanese ship, and we talked about it, by the way, in one of the lectures. There was a Japanese ship over there, and it was a freighter that had come in from Japan. And that ship, the captain who was there, recognized what was taking place because he remembered in his homeland in Japan what happened in some type of massacre or what have you. They were loaded with silks and all types of things in a boat. The Japanese captain told his people, his mariners, throw these things into the water, these wealthy things, silks, etc. Throw them into the water and take these people on board. And they actually literally took 900 Greeks and Armenians and brought them to the port of Athens. Not a lot is written about this, but this is one of the things that we're exploring, by the way. In terms of the captain, they were trying to find the captain's name. Everybody thinks it's Captain Lou. It's not me, but there was a Captain Lou that apparently saved these 900 people.
Why wasn't there more foreign aid to the Greek people? From like England, from France?
As Brother Lou was saying, it's the foreign policy of the powers back then was not to interfere. They actually didn't want to see Turkey fall, the Ottoman Empire. They didn't know exactly what was going to happen with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, because Atatürk was against the Sultan, because those Turks viewed the Sultan as being weak and pro-Western, and they wanted to create something different out of Turkey. And he had made a temporary treaty with Lenin that if he gets support from the Bolsheviks, if they win, which at the time 1918 already had won, he will make Turkey, the new Turkey, also communist, which he renegated after that. So they didn't know exactly, you know, America, Britain, they didn't know how to play the cards yet, and they didn't want to see the Sultanate fall, the Ottoman Empire fall yet, but they knew it was happening. So there's also the French powers, colonial powers. You know, it was Russia, it was England. You know, having Turkey, having Greece get help, that means they will get more land. You know, that's meaning we had an army there, and we were actually on the brink of capturing some of our lands back, and that was the catastrophe that led to a lot of this other catastrophes with the genocide. So it was a lot of things happening, and the Western powers were never really going to help Greece at the time. They didn't want to see a bigger Greece because they wanted to control the Straits of the Dardanelles and all that stuff. So.
Well, yeah. Also, after World War I, what happened was that Greece was given the protectorate of Smyrna and all those areas. And that's what caused basically the Turkish-Greek War of 1919-1922. The Western powers had said to Greece basically go in there and protect you know, the Hellenic people and all the rest of that, but in reality they didn't support them in any way. So when in fact the war was lost in 1922, and that's part of the reason why, by the way, the city was burned, and they did it consciously. There was no support from the Western powers at all for Greece. And in the meanwhile, they were busy basically grabbing the other parts of the Ottoman Empire. In other words, they were in the Middle East, carving up the Middle East between France and Britain. So they had other scenarios going on. They had no interest whatsoever.
They feared Greece will resurrect the Byzantine Empire again. That was something that was not going to happen realistically, but that was a fear. If they get Constantinople, Greece, and Asia Minor, and if Ankara falls, Greece might become another superpower, you know, out of nowhere again after so many hundreds of years, and they feared that. And this is the modern phenomena that Byzantium has been buried in, you know, there's no movies, there's nothing written about it in Greece or elsewhere, because also the Turks dominate that. They believe they're the successors, and they tell that story right now. And because it's not promoted in Greece proper, nobody's gonna know about who's a Christian, what happened to those Christians, why there were Christians in Turkey or the Middle East. You know, Byzantium is something that's kind of like being erased, and the Turks have monopolized that. So that's another problem. You know, we're losing a lot of PR, if you want to call it, about our history and our culture.
We do have recognition efforts going, and I think this is probably one of the most important things for us to realize. It's important not only for our audience to understand these things, but for our entire community to understand that we were victims of an atrocity as a culture and as a religion. And so currently, it's separated into Asia Minor, Pontus, and Eastern Thrace. Asia Minor remembers their genocide, it's September 14th. Pontus, May 19th. Eastern Thrace, April 6th. Now, it's regional recognition right now. We have a lot of regional recognition. There are a few states that have recognized it as Pontic genocide, Asia Minor genocide, Thrace genocide. At the end of the day, they were all ethnically Greek. It's not a regional genocide, it's a Hellenic genocide. 1.2 million were killed or deported at that time. So you look at the Armenian recognition, they united as one community. They have recognition as an Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day in 48 US states, whereas Hellenic genocide is only fully recognized in the state of South Dakota. We are currently pushing for full recognition in Florida, Rhode Island, and possibly some other states in addition to the federal level. And I think this is where I think the conversation starts, is what do we do to raise awareness about this? What do we do to gain recognition? What do we do to unite us as a community? And I think this is where we start that, by understanding that 8 years, 3.5 million Christians killed, 1.2 million of those were ethnic Greeks, and it's up to us to do something about it. Thank you. All right, thank you again to Billy and Lou for participating in the panel. Thank you everybody for coming out.
MGTV USA. Οι δραστηριότητες της ελληνοαμερικανικής κοινότητας με βίντεο και πλήρες ρεπορτάζ. Επισκεφτείτε την ιστοσελίδα μας mgtvusa.com. Καλύπτουμε καθημερινά τα γεγονότα στην Ομογένεια.